Kindred of the East, also known as the Kuei-jin, share many similarities with Western vampires. Despite the similarities, they in fact are not related to Western Cainites, as the Kuei-jin do not share Cain as their progenitor. Despite their uncommon ancestry, some could argue that their differences are arguably semantics. Kindred of the East, as a playbook, was made to enable Asian players to have lore and representation in the World of Darkness. This is because WoD is a Western brand, so most of WoD's history is based around Europe and North America. But White Wolf saw a market in Asia, and so they created Kindred of the East. The Kuei-jin's presence and lore implications in the World of Darkness, at least in terms of main plots and the true timeline, are quite important, as they have almost total control of Asia and had conquered the entirety of the west coast of America by the early 2000s, all done from within the shadows and while winning against their western cousins. Like VtM, Kindred of the East is more focused on roleplay than on combat, but this playbook is a bit more balanced between combat and roleplay compared to VtM, due to the Kuei-jin's origins as holy soldiers of a Chinese god.
People.
In fact, the biggest difference between Kindred of the East and VtM is how spiritual the Kuei-jin are. VtM focuses almost entirely on the political side of being an undead abomination. But Kuei-jin, thanks to not only their origins but also the cultures of the East, leans heavily into their spiritual side and the importance of the spirituality of being an undead abomination. That's not to say the politics of the undead don't matter. After all, they are invading the west coast of America for mostly political reasons. It's just that you shouldn't expect the same level of importance being placed on political conflicts by the Kuei-jin in comparison to the political conflicts of the vampires and their three-way war between the Sabbat, Camarilla, and Anarchs. Kindred of the East was made for two reasons: for Asia-based players and for players who want a similar experience to VtM while dipping their toes into the more supernatural and spiritual side of the World of Darkness. It could be said that Kindred of the East is the halfway point between Wealth the Apocalypse and Vampire the Masquerade, in terms of the Byzantine machinations of empiric bureaucracy mixed with the cosmic mysticism and infernal dread of the spirit realm. I would argue that the main reason to play Kindred of the East would be if you live in Asia, as VtM's focus is the Western world, while Kindred of the East fills out the rest of the map in Asia. This leaves only Central and South America not specifically covered by a World of Darkness playbook. Despite not being Cainites, Kindred of the East presumes that you already know what vampires are and how they work, because despite being similar to vampires, there are enough differences between a vampire and a Kuei-jin to make those differences matter, and the playbook relies on your knowledge of vampires to make you understand those differences, be it for roleplay or mechanics. This is made even more obvious by the fact you must also read into Wealth the Apocalypse's lore, as Kindred of the East requires the storyteller and the players to all know how the spiritual works in WoD. So if you want to consider yourself prepared for play, a player and storyteller must first read and understand VtM, then WTA, and finally get into Kindred of the East. While that isn't all necessary, it is the optimal route for playing Kindred of the East. Additionally, if you don't like anime or visual content, you probably won't like this playbook, as it relies heavily on tropes from those types of Asian media, as that is where most of the inspiration for Code E came from. The last big reason not to play is that you don't live on the west coast of America or in Asia. These are the only two locations you'll find the main force of the Kuei-jin, and so you'll either have to be intimately familiar with those locations or live there for the true Kuei-jin experience. The differences and similarities between the Kuei-jin and the Cainites are quite interesting, especially since they have known about each other since antiquity at the latest. While they did fight each other more often than not, the two monstrous races have one big commonality: a vampire's Golconda and a Kuei-jin's enlightenment, which I could best summarize as his search to become human again. One cannot talk about Cainites and the Kuei-jin without talking about the biggest difference, that being their origins. I've already explained the vampire's origins in their video. A long time after the Cainites were first embraced, the Kuei-jin were created to be the august person of Jade's earthly army, the APJ being a kind of Chinese god. But it's a bit more complicated than that, because the APJ may also be Christian god and or Gaia. World of Darkness is complicated like that. To cut a long story short, the august person of Jade, who I'm just going to call the August, went away for 2 minutes to get some milk and cigarettes, and when he actually came back with said milk and cigarettes, he witnessed his earthly army cannibalizing the normies they were supposed to be protecting. The August was not happy about this, and so cursed his Ubermenschen to become off-brand vampires. To differentiate them, he decided that instead of burning in the sun, their flesh would rot. This, of course, did not stop this army of darkness from consuming the ki of the normies. In fact, it made consuming ki even more mandatory than before. Appearing later than the Cainites, the Kuei-jin have been around long enough to inspire legends. Like how the Cainites were the inspirations for many Western vampiric myths and legends, the Kuei-jin were the inspirations for many of the Asian-inspired vampiric myths and legends, the most blatant being the jumping vampire. While the Western Kindred once ruled over man openly, the Kuei-jin have always been sticking to the shadows, which is why their myths and legends are a lot simpler than Western Cainite myths, as the people of Asia never had that much information about the Kuei-jin, never knowing enough to form proper fables and stories about them. Cainite vampires are almost all firmly rooted on Earth, fighting a war of ideology and superiority with one another. The Kuei-jin aren't just fighting amongst themselves for ideological supremacy, they also have to fight otherworldly threats, such as a worm and oblivion.
Stop.
This is what I mean by Kindred of the East being a halfway point between Werewolf the Apocalypse and Vampire Masquerade. The powers and weaknesses of a vampire are similar to those of a Kuei-jin, but the Kuei-jin hold a similar position to the Garou in their cultures and societies. In terms of the amount of lore, Kindred of the East was actually given greater depth to the Kuei-jin than just vague passing mentions. Much unlike a certain other playbook I could mention. The Kuei-jin have more than a shin-deep connection to the Greater World of Darkness thanks to their invasion and occupation of the west coast of America. If you want to learn more about this west coast invasion, play Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines. What's here to play? I'm kidding, this isn't Mummy the Resurrection. Kindred of the East has a revised edition playbook called, well, Kindred of the East, and also a few other books. But as you could guess, never really got development beyond just being Asian vampires. The community for Kindred of the East isn't that large, probably because World of Darkness isn't that popular in the East to begin with, so most of the people who could actually get a kick out of playing Kindred of the East would be those living on the west coast of America. While not every playbook needs to exist for everyone everywhere, creating a playbook for a market that doesn't really exist isn't exactly a great business strategy, especially when a better and more developed alternative already exists.